The town was glowing the way it always did on Christmas Eve, windows wrapped in golden lights, laughter spilling from warm houses, and carols floating through the cold air like a promise that everything, at least for tonight, was okay. Every street had a song. Every home seemed to hum with joy. Every home except one. As I walked past it, I noticed the silence immediately. No lights blinking in rhythm. No familiar melody drifting through cracked windows. Just darkness and stillness, as if Christmas itself had skipped that door. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe no one was home, maybe they'd gone away, but the longer I stood there, the heavier the silence felt. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something unspoken, something aching. And then I heard it, not a carol, not music at all, but a faint sound that felt like grief trying not to be heard. In that moment, I realized the loudest stories are often the ones told without a single song. Christmas had always been a season of noise here. Children practiced carols until their parents begged for quiet, churches echoed with hymns sung little too loudly and a little off-key, families argued, laughed, forgave, and gathered again around tables that held more memories than food. We measured happiness in melodies and togetherness. Silence, especially at Christmas, felt unnatural, almost wrong. That house had once been part of the noise, part of the music, part of us. I remembered it clearly. Years ago, their carol was always the first one heard on the street, drifting out before sunset, confident and joyful. Now, standing there in the cold, I understood that something had taken that song away. Whatever lived inside those walls wasn't celebrating, it was surviving. And as the rest of the town sang on, unaware, I knew the story of the Christmas carol that no one was singing was one that needed to be told, because sometimes the greatest loss isn't joy itself, but the belief that we're still allowed to feel it. The house had not always been quiet. Once, it had been the loudest on the street, the kind of place people smiled at as they walked past, because music always spilled out before the door even opened. Years ago, Christmas there began, early decorations pulled from boxes before December arrived, lights tangled and tested, laughter echoing through open windows. The carols played on repeat, sometimes sung loudly and badly, sometimes hummed while cooking or cleaning. It was a house that believed in Christmas without irony, without restraint. That was before the silence moved in. Now the windows were dark, curtains drawn tight as if trying to hide from the season itself. Inside, the air felt heavier than the cold outside. Dust rested on the piano keys that once carried the first notes of every Christmas morning. A single ornament sat on the table, its red paint chipped, untouched for years. The radio remained unplugged. Not because it was broken, but because turning it on would invite memories that hurt too much to face. The man who lived there sat alone in an armchair near the fireplace, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He had aged quietly, the kind of aging that doesn't come from years alone, but from carrying regret along. His name didn't matter to the town anymore. People remembered the version of him that belonged to carols and candlelight, not this quieter figure who now existed only in the margins of their celebrations. Christmas Eve had always been his favorite night. It used to mean family voices overlapping, mugs clinking, arguments dissolving into laughter. His wife had loved carols most of all. She believed singing together fixed things. Even when nothing else could, when their child was small, they sang off-key and unapologetic, turning mistakes into jokes, memories into traditions. For years, the same song ended the night, slow and gentle, sung softly after everyone else had gone to sleep. That song had not been heard in this house since the winter everything changed. It hadn't happened all at once. Loss rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as distance, as exhaustion, as words left unsaid. One Christmas had passed with fewer decorations. Another with no singing until the very end. Then one year there was no music at all. Just the sound of a door closing, followed by a silence that never fully lifted. The man told himself he hated Christmas now. He said it was overrated, too loud, too full of expectations people couldn't keep. But the truth was harder. He didn't hate Christmas. He missed it. And missing something that reminds you of who you failed to protect hurts more than anger ever could. Outside, the town continued its rituals. Children rehearsed at the church. Choirs warmed their voices. Neighbours waved cheerfully, unaware that behind one unlit window sat a man counting the years since he last heard a carol sung for him. Sometimes people knocked, offering baked goods or invitations. He declined politely, always with the same excuse: tired, busy, not feeling well. Eventually, the knocking stopped. That night, as snow began to fall lightly against the glass, he stood and walked slowly toward the piano. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. He didn't press them. He never did. The sound felt too sacred now, too tied to a time he couldn't go back to. Instead, he closed the lid gently, as if afraid even the memory of music might escape. Across the street, children's voices rose in song, imperfect but joyful. The melody drifted toward his house, slipping through the cracks of the world he'd built to keep himself numb. For a moment, his chest tightened. He considered turning on the radio, just for background noise, just to drown out the past. But he didn't. He listened instead. Memories came uninvited. His wife standing by the tree, smiling softly. A small voice asking to sing it again, louder this time. A promise made in a kitchen late one night that no matter what happened, they would always sing on Christmas Eve. That promise had been broken, not by betrayal or cruelty, but by silence, by distance, by waiting too long to say what mattered. He sat back down, staring at the floor, the song from outside fading as the children moved on. The house returned to stillness. But something had shifted. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel protective. It felt accusing. Like the walls were asking how long he planned to punish himself for a moment he could never undo. The carol that no one was singing wasn't missing because it had been forgotten. It was missing because it had been buried under guilt, under grief, under the fear that joy was no longer deserved. And as Christmas Eve deepened into night, the man realized something he had avoided for years. Silence was not honoring what he had lost. It was only ensuring that the song would never return unless someone was brave enough to try. Outside, the bells rang softly, calling the town to midnight service. Inside, the house waited still, dark, and aching for the first note to be played again. Snow had covered the street by the time midnight passed, smoothing the world into something almost gentle. The town slept beneath a white hush, broken only by distant bells and the crunch of boots from late walkers heading home. Inside the dark house, the man remained awake. He had not moved from the chair. Sleep avoided him on nights like this, as if it knew better than to ask for entry. He paused there now, foot hovering, memory tightening his throat, then stepped forward anyway. In the hallway stood a framed photograph he had never taken down. His wife had insisted it stay. If we hide it, she'd said, we pretend it never happened. In the photo, all three of them stood in front of the old tree, lights glowing too brightly, smiles wide and real. It was taken the last Christmas before everything fractured. He reached out and straightened the frame. Though it hadn't moved, he didn't know why he walked toward the spare bedroom. He hadn't entered it in years. The door had remained closed out of habit, not instruction. As though the house itself understood that some rooms carried too much weight. Tonight, his hand found the knob without permission from his mind. The door opened with a soft resistance, air stale and untouched. Moonlight slipped through the thin curtains, illuminating a bed neatly made, a bookshelf half full. A small desk by the window. The room had become a museum of a life paused mid-sentence. Nothing was broken, nothing was packed away. It was as if the person who belonged here had simply stepped out and forgotten to come back. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. His fingers brushed against a folded sweater at the foot of the bed, still there, still soft. His breath hitched, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember the night that changed everything. It had been Christmas Eve too. Not snowing, then just bitter cold and tension thick enough to taste. Words had been exchanged, careless and sharp. Not shouting. Shouting would have been easier to forgive. It was the quiet words, the disappointed ones, that did the real damage. He had been tired, distracted, certain there would be time later. There was always later until there wasn't. When the door closed that night, it didn't slam. It clicked shut, polite and final. He remembered standing in the living room, listening for footsteps that never returned. By morning, the house had already begun learning how to be silent. He stood abruptly, the memory pressing too hard, and crossed to the desk. In the top drawer lay a stack of notebooks. He hadn't known they were there. His hand hesitated before lifting one, as if he might be accused of trespassing. The pages were filled with handwriting he recognized instantly, careful, thoughtful, songs, half-written lyrics. Notes about melodies, carols, some familiar, some original. All unfinished. His chest tightened as he flipped through them. Page after page of words meant to be sung, not hidden. On the last page was a single line, written more boldly than the rest. "Someday we'll sing this together again." He closed the notebook slowly and pressed it to his chest. The house felt smaller now, like it was leaning in, listening, for years. He had told himself the song was gone because it hurt too much. He stood there, unable to move, fear and anticipation colliding in his chest. Another knock followed, slightly firmer. He walked to the front door as though pulled by something stronger than memory. When he opened it, the cold rushed in first. A figure stood on the porch, bundled in a coat too thin for the weather. Snow clung to her hair, her scarf crooked, her eyes tired but familiar in a way that hurt. She looked older, so did he. For a moment, neither spoke. "I didn't know if you'd answer," she said finally, voice trembling. Not from the cold. He couldn't find words. His hands shook at his sides. He stepped back, letting her in without question. The door closed behind her, sealing them inside a space that suddenly felt fragile. They stood awkwardly in the hallway, ears pressing down between them. She glanced around, noticing what hadn't changed and what had. Her eyes flicked to the dark piano, then away. "I heard the bells," she said softly, "and I remembered everything." He nodded, afraid to speak. Afraid if he did, his voice might break open something he'd spent years locking away. "I found the notebooks," he said instead, surprising himself. Her eyes widened slightly. "You did?" He held one out. She took it, fingers brushing his, both flinching at the contact. She flipped through the pages, a sad smile forming. "I never finished them," she said. "I thought maybe one day." The silence stretched, not empty this time, but heavy with things unsaid. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. The words felt small but necessary for letting the song die. She looked at him then. Really looked, and something softened. "It didn't die," she said. "It just didn't have a voice." They stood there, surrounded by years of quiet, by a Christmas that had almost passed without them, and for the first time since the silence began, the possibility of music returned not as a memory, but as a fragile promise waiting to be tested. The kettle screamed before either of them realized it had been left on too long, the sharp sound slicing through the fragile quiet that had settled between them. He rushed to the kitchen, hands clumsy, while she remained standing in the hallway staring at the coat rack, as if it might explain how so many years could disappear and still leave everything standing where it once had been. Steam fogged the small kitchen window as he poured water into two mismatched mugs. One had a faded holly print, chipped at the rim. He hesitated before handing it to her, unsure if she would remember it the way he did how she used to insist it made tea taste better because it looked like Christmas. She accepted it with a faint smile that suggested she did remember. They sat at the small table, the same one that had once been crowded with wrapping paper and laughter. Now it held only two cups and the space between them. Outside, the town's church bells rang again, softer this time, as if aware they were intruding. "I almost turned back," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "I stood at the corner for 10 minutes, arguing with myself. I almost didn't open the door," he admitted. She looked up then, not offended, just honest. "I wouldn't have blamed you." The truth hovered between them, fragile but necessary. He realized that if they spoke too carefully, nothing real would ever be said. If they spoke too harshly, everything might collapse again. "I heard your crawling group earlier," he said, down by the square. Her lips pressed together. "I still sing." "Not like before." "But yes, they sounded good. They were missing something," she replied softly. "A harmony that never shows up." He swallowed. The piano loomed in the living room like a sleeping witness. He hadn't touched it since the night the house learned how to echo. "I found the last song," he said after a pause. "The one you never finished." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "I wrote that after I left." He nodded. "I know." She stood suddenly, restless, and walked toward the living room. He followed at a distance, unsure whether he was welcome or merely tolerated. She stopped in front of the piano, brushing snow from her coat, eyes tracing the familiar shape. "You kept it," she said. "I didn't know how to get rid of it," he answered. "It felt like erasing proof that we ever made music." She lifted the lid slowly. The keys reflected the dim light, slightly yellowed with age, but intact. She pressed one, gently. The note rang out soft, imperfect, but alive. Both of them froze as the sound filled the room, colliding with years of silence. "I was angry," she said suddenly, not turning around. "Not because you didn't listen that night, but because you didn't try after." He felt the words like a bruise. "I thought giving you space was the right thing. I needed effort," she replied. "I needed to know the song mattered enough for you to chase it." He leaned against the doorway, the weight of regret finally finding its voice. "I didn't know how to fix what I broke." She turned then, eyes glistening. "Neither did I, so I ran." Another silence followed, but this one was different, less sharp, more thoughtful. Outside, a group of children laughed, their voices drifting through the night like reminders that time didn't stop for grief. She sat at the piano bench, hesitating before placing both hands on the keys. Do you remember how it starts? He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was younger, standing beside her, turning pages, counting beats. Yes, he said, I never forgot. She played the opening notes, tentative at first. Then steadier, the melody stumbled, paused. Then found its footing. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. He found himself humming along. Quietly, afraid to break the spell. Halfway through, she stopped. I can't, she whispered. Not alone. His heart pounded. This was the moment everything balanced on fear, hope, pride, forgiveness. He stepped closer. Standing beside her, voice barely above a breath. Then don't be, she nodded once. And started again. This time, when the melody rose, his voice joined hers, not strong. Not confident, but sincere. The harmony wavered, then settled, filling the room with something that felt dangerously close to healing. Tears slipped down her face as they sang the last line, the unfinished line, finally given sound. When the final note faded, neither of them spoke. The house seemed warmer somehow, as if it had been waiting for permission to breathe again. I never stopped loving this place, she said. I just didn't think I belonged here anymore. He turned to her fully now. You always did. I just didn't say it when it mattered. She looked at him, searching for something truth, maybe. Whatever she found made her nod slowly. I can't stay long, she said. I have a life now. Not perfect. Not simple. I'm not asking you to stay, he replied. I'm asking you to sing. She smiled through tears. Then we should finish the song. He reached for the notebook on the side table and handed it to her. She opened it, smoothing the pages. And together they read the last line again, the promise written years ago by someone who still believed. Outside, the bells rang once more, louder now, joyful and unafraid. And for the first time in years, the house answered not with silence, but with music returning home. Morning crept into the house quietly, as if unsure it was welcome. Pale winter light slipped through the curtains and rested on the walls, revealing details long ignored, small cracks near the ceiling, framed photos tilted slightly. Off-center, dust that sparkled like frost in the air. He woke in the armchair where sleep had finally claimed him, the echo of last night's song still humming somewhere deep in his chest. For a moment, he thought it had been a dream. Then he heard movement in the kitchen. She was there, standing at the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair loosely tied back the way she used to when she stayed longer than planned. The smell of toast filled the room, warm and ordinary, yet powerful enough to make his throat tighten. Christmas morning had arrived, and for the first time in years, the house acknowledged it. I hope you don't mind, she said without turning around. I couldn't sleep. I never minded, he replied. His voice sounded rough, unused to mornings like this. They ate in comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Outside, the street was alive now, cars passing, children laughing, doors opening and closing. Life moving forward, whether one was ready or not. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then away, as if afraid of what time might ask of her. I have to be at the shelter by noon, she said finally. We're serving lunch, he nodded. He had heard about the shelter through neighbours, how she volunteered there every holiday, singing with those who had nowhere else to go. It made sense. She had always believed music belonged where it was needed most. You're doing good work, he said. She smiled softly. It helps me remember why I started singing in the first place. After breakfast, she wandered the house slowly, touching familiar things like a visitor who still knew where everything belonged. She paused by the hallway mirror, adjusting the scarf around her neck. You kept the photo, she said. He followed her gaze. A faded picture of the three of them stood their arms around each other mid-laugh, caught in a moment that hadn't known it was fragile. I tried to take it down once, he admitted, couldn't do it. She reached out, straightened the frame. I'm glad. They stopped again by the piano. Sunlight now washed over it, revealing fingerprints from the night before, proof. She sat, played a few notes. Lighter this time, testing how the room responded in daylight. It sounded different, less haunting. More hopeful. You know, she said, we don't have to pretend everything is fixed. I know, he replied. I just don't want to pretend it never mattered. She looked at him then, really looked, as if measuring the distance between who he was and who he was trying to be. It always mattered, she said. Even when we were failing each other, a knock came at the door, startling them both. He opened it to find a young boy from next door, bundled in a coat too big for him, holding a small paper bag. My mom said to bring you these, the boy said. She heard singing last night. Inside the bag were cookies, uneven and homemade. He laughed quietly, a sound that surprised them both. Tell your mom thank you, the boy hesitated. Are you going to sing tonight too? He glanced back at her. She smiled and nodded once. Yes, he said, we are. After the boy left, something settled between them, not certainty, not closure, but intention. She pulled on her coat, ready to leave. Then stopped at the door. I can come back tonight, she said, after the shelter, if you want. He didn't hesitate. I'd like that. When the door closed behind her, the house didn't fall silent the way it used to. It held onto the echo of her presence, like a promise not yet fulfilled. He spent the morning doing things he hadn't done in years, clearing space around the piano, wiping dust from shelves, opening windows just a little to let the cold air refresh the rooms. He found old sheet music in a drawer, edges curled, notes handwritten in the margins. He stacked them neatly, unsure why, only knowing it felt right. By evening, the house glowed, not brightly, not loudly but warmly. A few lights twinkled on the tree he had finally set up that afternoon. Modest and imperfect. When she returned, cheeks red from the cold, carrying the sound of distant laughter with her, she stopped in the doorway, eyes shining. You did all this, she asked. For us, he said. They stood together as night fell, the same night that once held only regret. This time, it held something else, an understanding that while time could not be undone, it could still be answered. And as they sat at the piano once more, voices ready, the carol that had once gone unsung waited patiently, knowing it was no longer alone. Snow began again just as evening settled, soft and steady, turning the street into something quieter than usual, as if the world itself had lowered its voice in respect from the living room window. The lights outside blurred into gentle halos, and for the first time in many years, he didn't feel the urge to close the curtains. He wanted to see it all, the night, the season, the proof that time was still moving and had not left him behind. She set her bag down near the door, shrugging off her coat. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes tired but bright in that way they used to be after long days filled with purpose. The shelter had been busy, she told him, fuller than expected. People with stories heavier than the winter coats they wore, people who sang anyway, even when their voices cracked. They don't sing because everything is okay, she said quietly. They sing because it isn't, he nodded. Understanding that more deeply now than he ever had before, they sat together in the living room. The tree lights blinking softly beside them, no television, no radio. Just the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the shared awareness that this night mattered. On the coffee table lay the old notebook, open, pages slightly curled, waiting. I kept thinking about the last verse today, she said. The one we never finished, so did I, he replied. I kept hearing it in my head, like it was trying to remind me of something. She picked up the notebook, reading silently for a moment. Then she laughed softly, shaking her head. We were so sure back then, so convinced that promises were enough. He smiled sadly. I thought love meant things would fix themselves, and I thought leaving would protect me, she said. Turns out both ideas were wrong. They moved to the piano together, sitting side by side, not touching yet, but close enough to feel each other's presence. She played the melody slowly, thoughtfully. Pausing between notes as if listening for something beyond sound, he watched her hands, remembering how he once believed they could solve anything. Maybe the song doesn't need to promise forever, she said suddenly. Maybe it just needs to be honest. He considered that. Then let's write honesty. They spoke the words out loud before setting them to music, testing them like fragile glass, words about forgiveness that didn't erase pain, about love that learned too late but learned anyway, about silence, and how dangerous it could be when mistaken for peace. Slowly, carefully, the verse took shape. When she played it again, his voice joined hers naturally, no hesitation this time. The harmony felt different, less desperate, more grounded, not the sound of people trying to reclaim the past, but of people choosing the present. Halfway through, there was another knock at the door. They looked at each other, surprised, then amused. He stood and opened it to find two neighbors from down the street, bundled together, smiling awkwardly. We didn't mean to intrude, one of them said, holding a small candle. But we heard music. Real music. And, well, it's been a while. He glanced back at her. She smiled, nodding gently. Come in, he said. More knocks followed. Not many, just a handful of familiar faces, people who had once been part of their lives in passing. No announcements, no invitations, just curiosity drawn by sound. Soon, the living room held quiet conversation, the warmth of bodies close together, the sense of something communal forming without effort. She stood by the piano, suddenly shy. I'm not sure they want to hear us practice, she whispered. He squeezed her hand lightly. They want to hear us be real. She took a breath and began to play. The room fell silent, not out of obligation, but respect. When she sang, her voice carried the weight of years and the gentleness of release. He joined her, steady, no longer afraid of being heard. The new verse unfolded, honest and raw, filling the space with something that felt earned. No one applauded when they finished. Instead, there were quiet smiles, misty eyes. A few hands pressed to chests. One woman whispered, "Thank you," as if she had been given something she didn't know she needed. Later, after the neighbors left and the candles burned low, the house settled again, but this time it felt fuller, not emptier. She leaned back against the piano, exhausted. I didn't know if I could ever sing here again, she admitted. I was afraid the walls would judge me. They've been waiting for you, he said softly. She laughed through tired tears. You always did talk to houses, and you always listened, he replied. They sat together until the fire died down, until midnight passed quietly without dread. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering old footprints, softening sharp edges inside. Two people sat with the understanding that healing wasn't a moment, it was a choice, made again and again. As she finally stood to leave, she paused at the door, turning back. Tomorrow, I'll go back to my life, she said. And you'll stay here, I know, he replied. But tonight, she continued, voice steady, we sang. And that matters, he nodded, unable to speak. When the door closed behind her, he didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it exist, no longer afraid. Because now he knew the difference between silence that destroys and silence that rests, between a carol that is forgotten and one that simply waits to be sung again. The night grew deeper after she left, but it no longer felt empty. The house held the warmth of voices long after the door closed. As if the walls had memorized the sound and were unwilling to let it go, he moved slowly through the rooms, turning off lamps one by one, careful not to rush the feeling that had settled inside him. Outside, the snow finally eased, leaving the world hushed and clean, like a page waiting for new words. He returned to the living room and stood before the piano. For the first time in years, he didn't hesitate. He lifted the lid and sat down, the bench creaking softly beneath him. His fingers hovered above the keys, unsure, then pressed down. The notes came out uneven, clumsy, but real. He played the melody again, their melody, letting it breathe without her voice, without an audience, without fear of doing it wrong. As he played, memories passed through him. Not as sharp wounds, but a scene softened by distance, a younger version of himself laughing too. Loudly. A promise made casually and broken without malice. A door closing that he had allowed to stay closed for too long. He didn't try to push the memories away. He let them sit beside him, part of the song now. When the final note faded, he rested his hands in his lap, heart steady. He realized something then that surprised him. He wasn't waiting anymore. Not for forgiveness, not for a second chance, not for time to rewind. He was present, and that, he understood, was the beginning of everything. Morning came gently again. The second in a row that did not feel like punishment. He woke early, brewed coffee, and opened the front door just enough to feel the cold air on his face. The street was quiet, marked only by footprints and the faint outline of yesterday's gathering. He imagined the neighbors waking up, carrying the echo of last night into their own homes. Maybe humming the tune without realizing where it came from. Later that day, he walked to the church. He hadn't been inside in years. Not since he deconvinced himself that faith and failure couldn't exist in the same place. But the doors were open, and the sound of rehearsal drifted out, familiar, imperfect, alive. He stood at the back, unnoticed at first, listening. The choir director paused when she saw him. There was a moment of recognition, then a small, careful smile. "We could use another voice," she said, not pushing, not questioning. He hesitated, then nodded. He took a seat, unsure of his place, heart pounding like it had on that first night all those years ago. When they began to sing, his voice joined quietly, then stronger. Not leading. Not hiding. Just present. That evening, she called not long. Just enough to ask how he was. "I sang today," he told her. There was a pause on the line, then a soft laugh. "I knew you would. I think," he said carefully, "I think the song wasn't meant to end that night. I think it was meant to teach us how to come back." She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it was meant to remind us that love doesn't disappear when it goes quiet. It just waits." They didn't promise anything. They didn't plan visits or talk about the future. They didn't need to. The call ended with something simpler, something braver. "Sing again soon," she said. "I will," he replied. That night, as the town settled into post-holiday stillness, he sat once more at the piano, playing softly. Outside, a child passed by with a parent. The sound of their laughter drifting through the cold air. Somewhere, a radio played a familiar tune. Somewhere else, a door opened and warmth spilled out into the night. The carol that no one was singing had found its way back, not as a performance, not as a tradition frozen in time, but as a living thing. Shaped by loss and survival, it lived now in imperfect voices, in small gatherings, in courage rebuilt slowly. He closed the piano and turned off the light, not out of avoidance, but peace. The house was no longer a place of silence. It was a place of rest. And as he went to bed, he understood something he wished he had known sooner. Some songs are not meant to be sung loudly. Some are meant to be lived note by note, breath by breath until silence no longer feels like the end. The house was quiet now, but it was no longer empty. Music had returned not perfectly, not flawlessly, but honestly, fully, and with the weight of years finally lifted. The carol that had gone unsung for so long now lived again, in their voices, in small echoes. And in every note that reminded them both that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. It was a journey that required courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to begin again, even when the past seemed too heavy to carry. If you felt the power of this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another emotional journey. Share this video with someone who believes in hope, healing, and the magic of second chances. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this to life, and every subscription means another story finds its way to someone who needs it. Stay with us for the next story, because every life has moments that break us and moments that remind us why we keep singing. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Which part of the story touched you the most? Let us know and be part of our growing community of listeners who cherish hope, love, and redemption. Subscribe now and join us for more stories that move the heart, warm the soul, and inspire change.